Undoubtedly, one of the most iconic elements of Fallout are the vaults. Many are rather famed and have powerful marketing potential. The vault experiments too are a pretty important part of the franchise's identity. However, despite how integral they seem to everyone now, the vaults weren't conceptualized with the tests in mind. Let's talk about the vault experiments. When Fallout was originally created, the vaults serviced the exact purpose one would have expected. They were legitimately large shelters designed for the safety of humanity. There were no hints of any kind to the cruel tests by vault-tec or the government. They were a shelter to save people and a chance for the future. The dark side, the experience that vaults are so famous for, was brought into the fold with Fallout 2, revealed by the Enclave. We learned that the vaults had the goal of collecting information on the vault residents who were subjected to cruel and unusual treatment. Since then, the studies have become a constant, reoccurring feature, often integral to the main plot of the games, or at least touched on by side content. Undoubtedly, the feature has become a cornerstone of the Fallout world, lore, and fan imagination. It's a certainly popular one, garnering lists about the cruelest experiments, fans speaking about their favorite tests, and even encouraging a DLC for Fallout 4, where you could run your own experiments. But were they really the best thing to add to the Fallout-verse? What are the advantages and disadvantages? Tim Kaine, Leonard Boyarsky, and Jason Anderson conceptualized the idea during the early stages of Fallout 2's development. According to Chris Avalon, who mostly credits Tim for it, the main reason that was added is because, well, it's creepy. It's this dystopian idea of a big evil organization taking advantage of the population's trust and ignorance, enveloped by President Richardson's revelation.
You might call it a social experiment on a grand scale.
Drilling into the psyche of various test subjects, watching how the populations of each react to a lack of supplies or purposefully creating design failures, all in the name of science. It is truly an unnerving and thought-provoking idea, an exciting and stimulating what if for those who like to let their mind wander. And undoubtedly, Fallout games have always had a theme of wandering around and finding new interesting things. Each protagonist has become witness to the apocalyptic world, but as the third main entry into the series propelled the franchise to the 3D environment, discovery has become much more engraved into the theme. What secrets could be sealed away behind the vault doors that a heroic wastelander could discover? What's the history here? Does it feature the terrible nature that we know the vaults are famous for? Or perhaps this is one of those few rare cases where a vault is truly designed to save other people. Can there be people still living inside it at that moment? Or are they going to be greeted by hostile forces, ghouls, robots, turrets, and monsters all around? Perhaps that last bit is truly the biggest benefit from a gameplay perspective. The experiments are a fantastic excuse for dungeons. They could be a large flooded labyrinth filled with ghouls, or a psychedelic trip of ghosts and hallucinations. The variety of tests means there are so many possibilities for dungeons of different flavors. They're the mystical cave of Fallout, but rather than stone walls and orcs, we have steel walls and supermutants. The inn could give a powerful new weapon, or a legendary piece of armor, all while telling you the sadistic history of a bygone era. The potential for new, interesting dungeons is perhaps limitless because the experiments are mysterious and unnerving. That all said, while the experiments are indeed unnerving, often violent, and terribly sadistic, they are, a lot of times, very, very dumb. We learn in Fallout 2 that these are social experiments, tests meant to collect data about how residents of these vaults acted in terrible conditions. And understandably, an overseeing overlord may want data about what to do if such scenarios come to pass in the future of their faction. Some of these set of scenarios may be possible: massive overpopulation, factions created via segregation of stimuli, and small but steady radiation exposure. However, I often fail to see what beneficial data is to be gained from basing an entire population on gambling, or a single man being isolated with puppets. Then there are some experiments that are sensible, at least in terms of data collection, but are so fixed on a specific set of conditions, it goes from being useful to just being malevolent, such as locking the residents up with a panther or pumping a vault full of psychoactive drugs. It can really cause it to lose more serious feeling that the original Fallout game had when all these experiments take place. Not necessarily for the idea of experimenting itself, but a lot of times it seems a lack of purpose. We can assume the goal of the experiment is to give the Enclave information about how to rebuild a world in their image. And Tim Kaine, which is on Flimsy Cannon, suggests that it might be for them to go to space. But there really isn't a situation where they need data on having one female and 999 males in a closed area. Honestly though, a lot of times I think it was added to the world for the shock and awe factor in Fallout 2, and not for the sake of any long-term story building. After all, Avalon suggests that Kane got the idea from watching X-Files and perhaps wanted to do something that was really dystopian. And while I could say it certainly did that, I wonder if it became overplayed. Vault-tec doing bad things kind of loses the shock factor when we know the vaults are pretty terrible. And traversing them now is honestly more shocking when an experiment isn't being performed on the residents. Perhaps giving to the original idea that the vaults were meant to protect would have kept the strength of the original Fallout. A good idea that may not have gone well, or perhaps Fallout needed to have the experiments to justify the dungeons and creepy atmosphere. Nevertheless, I do wonder what would happen if Fallout 2 never introduced this idea. Would Bethesda have added the experiments as their own shock factor? Would the vaults in Fallout 3 be dungeons like they are? And if so, would they have used constant unforeseen problems to justify them as dungeons? Still, whether it was for the best or it honestly jumped the shark and went rather wacky, it doesn't truly matter. In the end, the vault experiments are popular. At the very least, I think we should probably have more normal vaults in the series, so it doesn't feel like the experimental vaults so heavily outweigh the control vaults. In doing so, they could keep the test from feeling overdone, which would in turn improve the dastardliness of vault-tec in the pre-war government. But what about you? What are your thoughts on the vault experiments?